Hello guys, it's Mr. Gutierrez again. Thank you for watching. In this video, I really want to get into some of the changes that are happening in the 18th century and that will have a long-term impact going into the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. First, like always, let's try and get into an objective. The objective for today is explain how and why the movement of a variety of people and ideas across the Atlantic contribute to the development of American culture over time. The thesis, the early to mid 18th century saw a diffusion of different intellectual, philosophical, and social ideas that would begin to change Europe. Furthermore, those ideas would spread across the Atlantic to the English colonies in North America. However, those ideas would change the colonies in ways different than Europe and England itself. First, let's discuss some of the intellectual ideas that are really going to influence from Europe in the 18th century, the early 1700s, into North American colonies. First of all, remember we talked about how the colonies are becoming more English. They want to be as English as possible, and part of that is the intellectual thinking. And as English, the British saw themselves as an empire of prosperity, liberty, and they really loved this idea of rule of law. And they felt as Englishmen, they had the rights of Englishmen and English liberty. So what does that mean? Well, part of that is the influence of these Enlightenment thinkers. Baron de Montesquieu later on will influence the idea of checks and balances. And so for the English, that's a very important idea in terms of power checked against the king. So that will influence the Constitution or the writing of the Constitution later in terms of checks and balances. But the general idea was to resist government when it stepped out of bounds. That's the general idea, to apply reason, to apply logic in all facets of society, but in terms of these political ideas, to apply reason to form a better kind of government. Most men did not have the right to vote, especially in England. But they did serve on juries, and when they needed to and when they wanted to, they did protest in the streets. There's going to be two ideas we're going to discuss today in terms of this intellectual, political ideas influencing the colonies. One is called republicanism, and the second one is called liberalism. So republicanism is the idea that if you own property, if you have land, you have virtue, that you possess this idea of virtue, you have a vested interest in society, and that you will work for the public good. And this idea comes from these Cato's letters, if you will. And the colonists were really fans of Cato's letters. And they felt that independent landowners held guard against political power to infringe on liberty. So people that own land should have the right to vote. So you got to remember that in terms of republicanism. Land ownership is tied to voting. And they feel that landowners are the ones responsible for participating in democracy, or rather in voting and participating in government. The second idea that's really going to influence the colonies is called liberalism. And John Locke really gave voice to what liberalism is. Government was formed basis of mutual agreements. I agree to live under the government, and the government agrees to govern me. But they have to have it with my consent. I have to agree with it. It's a contract. The government and me work together. I give my permission to the government, and the government gets to have some control over me. But the one other aspect of it is this idea of natural rights, that people have individual rights. Thomas Jefferson will later change that to unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence. But the government must get consent from the governed, from the people. And when government doesn't listen, when government violates this contract, this agreement, then the people in turn have a right to rebel. So he died really early. I think it was the year 1704 when he finally passed away. So he'll never see the ideas actually come into being in terms of the American Revolution. But a lot of things he says are reverberated later in terms of what the revolutionaries are saying. So republicanism, important. Landowners are the ones that have the right to vote. So if you think about this, the colonists are used to owning land. Back home in England, there's not a land available aside from the gentry, from nobility. So most people in England do not vote because they do not own land. But you see a difference here in the colonies. In the colonies, there are a lot of people that own land. And since a lot of people that own land, they are accustomed to voting and they are accustomed to participating in government. Owning land was a restriction for colonists. It allowed more people to vote because there was simply more land available. And of course, you have that mixed in with liberalism by John Locke, this idea that, hey, if government's not listening to me more and I'm voting, then I have a right to rebel. I have a right to protest. Government should be telling me what to do if I don't have a say. Hence, later on, no taxation without representation. So, the American Enlightenment, every institution, authority, and tradition should be evaluated based on reason. So that's kind of the hallmark of the Enlightenment, is reason and logic. It's kind of gave birth to science and other political ideas and how basically we should run society. And part of this was a reaction in Europe. Part of the context here is it was a reaction to what was happening in Europe at the time. War after war after war was fought over religion. People were dying. People were getting killed in Europe over religion. And so these Enlightenment thinkers felt this is irrational. And they felt reason should determine things. Some ideas came from John Locke again. In 1695, he wrote religious beliefs should be based on scientific evidence. Arminianism, I might be butchering the name, is an idea, a belief system, that reason was capable of making the essentials of religion. Deism, who Thomas Jefferson could be considered a deist, believed that God did not perform miracles, and science is the basis for understanding creation. Think of it this way. If God created a universe according to the deism, but once God made creation, God created everything, he backed off. He let it go. No miracles, nothing. So an Enlightenment thinker would say the way we understand the universe is not through religion, but through science. We understand God's creation through the lens of science because God gave us the gift of thinking and using reason. So that's the Enlightenment. Another thing that is developing in the 18th century in the colonies are new cultural aspects, new social interactions, and some old ones too. In New York, remember Leslie's Rebellion? There are still strong divisions between economic classes and ethnic groups. So you still have this embedded resentment between people of different economic situations and different ethnicities. But again, the other thing that's happening, we talked about republicanism, is that in the colonies, you have this land requirement for voting. It's not a restriction per se. If you don't own land, you cannot vote. But there's so many more people that own land in the colonies compared to Europe. So therefore, there's a lot more people voting in the colonies. Economic independence allowed for freedom and liberty to think. So in other words, also, if you own land, you have the ability to have free time to think because you're not working for wages. You have liberty. You have freedom when you own land because you don't have to report to anyone else. You are your own boss. You have economic independence. So no one can hold anything over for you to vote a certain way. So land is giving that freedom to be economically independent, but also politically independent. 50 to 80% of white men in colonies could vote because they own land. 50 to 80%. In England, that's less than 5%. So that's a dramatic difference in how many people are participating in politics than in England. Blacks, unfortunately, generally were losing suffrage left and right. There were more and more laws, especially in Virginia, especially in the South, that were going against African Americans and their ability to participate. Usually, The difference, though, in the colonies is that people were appointed to power. So not everyone could necessarily be in charge. Lots of appointments were coming from England. But the requirements for holding office were usually higher than voting itself. Voters were expected to choose people from higher in society, and usually that meant the gentry. So just because you could vote doesn't necessarily mean you could run for office. Remember, this is still a society based on class, and usually people had to be born into a situation to have a position of power. The other thing that's affecting the colonies this time is this idea of salutary neglect. In the 1700s, England was preoccupied with a series of conflicts and European rivals. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the French and Indian War. But over time, colonial assemblies kind of took power, and elites took control of these colonies. So over time, because England's not really paying attention to the colonies, they're left to their own devices and becoming used to making decisions for their own. So that's going to come into play later, because after the French and Indian War, colonists are going to say, wait a second, you're trying to pass taxes on us? We didn't approve this, because they're so used to doing things on their own. They're not used to England taking control. You also have the expansion of political organization and debate. Printing presses are increasing dramatically in the colonies. You have more libraries. More people are reading in the colonies. You have a very literate group of people in the colonies, and they're participating more. They're also reading more newspapers about current events and political debates. And the other thing, too, is that you have freedom of expression that's really taking off in the colonies, maybe more so back home. But it's not what you think in terms of freedom of expression like we have today. People didn't necessarily have the ability to say anything they wanted back then. Pretty much that was Parliament. The idea was that people in Parliament when debating had the freedom of expression, but outside of that, there was no real legal protection. They felt it was dangerous for ordinary people to say anything they wanted because they could be misled by printed materials. That if a group of people were reading things in the newspaper and the government felt that could be dangerous if those ideas proved disastrous. So freedom of expression is not necessarily what we think of today. Elected assemblies usually discourage freedom of the press. Okay, they didn't really necessarily feel like the newspapers can say anything they wanted. However, things change in the colonies in 1735 as a product of the Enlightenment, as a product of a lot of these things. Things begin to change. Things change in 1735 with the Zinger trial. In New York, John Peter Zinger wrote critically of the governor, claimed that he was corrupt and that he was a tyrant. And the judge said the conviction had to be based if he actually printed those things. Remember, there's no such thing as freedom of the press at this time. And the judge said if he printed it, then he should be convicted. The lawyer argued something instead. Zinger's lawyer argued that if he printed these things and they turn out to be false, then he should be guilty. But the lawyer argued if they are true, then he should not be guilty because these things are true. Lawyer argued to decide if his statements were true or not and based it on that conviction. And Zinger's lawyer won the trial. It represented an idea that free expression was becoming a part of political thinking and cultural thinking of the time. So this idea of free expression in 1735 is starting to influence his colonies. It's like freedom of speech. So more and more people in the colonies, because they have land, because they can vote, are participating in politics. Europeans will visit the colonies this time and be amazed at how much the people publicly are talking about politics, because normal people back home don't do that. And part of that reason is because they do not own land. They don't have a vested interest in government, so they're not expressing themselves. They're not involved in politics. But the colonists, because so many own land, they're participating in politics. And last but not least is the Great Awakening. It's another aspect that's going to influence things later on in terms of the American Revolution. In some ways, it's a reaction enlightenment because it represents religious ideas. And some people did not appreciate the ideas that science would be used to explain religion. But the other problem that's going on in the early 18th century is that people are really not involved in the church like they used to be anymore, especially in Massachusetts. The hotbed of Puritan society, the church attendance is very low. People aren't really feeling an emotional investment in the church anymore. But something started to change. Throughout Western society, throughout Europe and Eurasia, you have this movement towards religion again. And the colonies, two big heavyweights in this will be Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards was a Massachusetts Congregationalist, and he had a very emotional style of preaching. But that emotional style of preaching would really get people in the pews. He claimed that only a new birth in Christianity, declaring his sins and asking for forgiveness, could save men. And he did it very vividly in his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. George Whitefield, an English minister, arrived in 1739, and he actually toured Georgia all the way to New England. And he argued against this idea of predestination that Puritans had believed in, this idea that God already knew who was going to heaven or hell, and there was nothing you could do about it. He challenged that idea that anyone could be saved by God. So this is really changing the colonies, because part of it is these two gentlemen are challenging religious authority and the older preachers. The older preachers are called the Old Lights. The new preachers are called the New Lights. And they're challenging religious authority. What is going to happen is that this idea of challenging authority in the early 1730s is going to bleed into other aspects of society, and the colonists are also going to have this idea that they can challenge authority in other ways as well. In closing, the 18th century really sets up cultural, political, philosophical ideas that are going to change society, change how the colonists think about themselves, change how the colonists think about themselves in relation to the government, and set up seeds for later on in terms of the American Revolution. The colonists think of themselves as English, but they don't understand that these changes in the colonies are making them different than the English that live in England. And they don't understand that until the American Revolution happens. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your time.